Hey, my name is Kevin Poller, and I am a member of the Reformed Baptist Church of Louisville. Welcome to the Reformation Today and Tomorrow podcast. I am joined with the pastor, my pastor, Pastor Jim Savastio. How are we doing today?
I'm doing well.
Good.
I always have to say when somebody says the pastor, I'm a pastor.
You're right. I'm so sorry. We have multiple pastors. I don't
Yeah.
mean to make any other
That's okay.
pastors less.
I'm just saying.
He's a pastor. But today's topic is something that might be sort of kind of newish, and that is we're seeing with a lot of churches, specifically the Protestant church, that people are leaving that and going to. I'm more familiar with the Eastern Orthodox Church that people are leaving Protestant and going to, but you mentioned before even the cameras were rolling that the Catholic Church is gaining some additional attendance to their services and whatnot. Why do you think that is?
Wow. We'll jump right in. Well, Kevin, let me just say this as we get started. So we're living at an interesting time in church history, particularly in the last 20, 30 years of American church history, where there has been a rising secularism, a rising unbelief. And I don't have all the statistics out in front of me, but basically where you would have seen, for instance, 30 years ago, perhaps 70% of American people identifying themselves as religious or as Christian, and those who would have described themselves as irreligious, or the common term being used now as nuns, Nones, and that is, I have no religious affiliation, where there was a declension in those who were attending churches, identifying as Christians, and there was a rise, particularly of your generation, and those a little bit older and a little bit younger, of saying that so it was going like this. These have stabilized to some degree now, and it seems almost a little bit more of locked in, so that the nuns are not rising as much as they were, and the religiously affiliated are not declining as much as they were. And so while there has been this demarcation between generations, so I'm part of the baby boomer generation. I'm on the tail end of the baby boomer generation, and then with Gen X, and then going on down with millennials, etc. You found less and less religion, more and more young people leaving the church. Now, fascinatingly, I'm getting to your point here. Fascinatingly, one of the religious divides was not just generational; it was gender based, and that is that women were more religious than men. For the first time since these kinds of studies have been happening, there's actually more men, young men, among younger people, let's say under 30. There are more younger men showing an interest in religious community and in conservatism more than girls and women. And so I think this is part of the tie-in. For years now, we have had an issue with young men. Sorry, buddy, here.
Yeah, I know.
But
Speaking of the choir.
No, but if you were to Google, put in something like the crisis of masculinity, or the crisis of young men feeling adrift, young men feeling empty, young men feeling despised, young men feeling like there's no direction, there's nothing under their feet, there's nothing historical, there's being ashamed of masculinity, etc. And so we have seen in a variety of ways, podcasts directed a lot toward men, the rise of the popularity of somebody like Jordan Peterson, and even Joe Rogan, and people like that are identifying guys who are adrift. I think we saw this a few years ago with a ministry like the Ministry of Mars Hill out in Seattle. You were out in Seattle during, I think, probably the beginnings of that. You lived out that way. And a guy like Mark Driscoll, who for all his faults and blots and blemishes, was appealing to young men and appealing to their virtue, appealing to their masculinity, appealing to them to stop watching video games, stop doing drugs, stop drinking, get married, get a job, stop looking at porn, stop masturbating, take control of your life, build your body, build your mind, build a home, build a family, and guys who felt adrift were being drawn to that, and there are certainly things in there that the Bible itself would appeal to. And so I think we have to take this broader picture of what evangelical Protestantism has come to look like, and without doing gross caricatures.
Mm.
The big churches, very often the more modern churches, seeker-friendly churches, took a much softer tone, a softer doctrinal tone, a softer tone in regard to masculinity and the family, male roles. They were not historical, they're not creedal, they're not confessional. The books out in the library were written in the last few years. The songs were written in the last few months or the last few weeks. And the buildings did not look like cathedrals. They did not inspire awe. They looked more like the theater. And so the music, the and again, I recognize I may be guilty of gross generalization here. I may be stereotyping, but the dry ice, blue lights, theater setting, darkened auditorium, lit stage, a guy coming out in shorts and flip flops, or wearing a football jersey, or even I mentioned Mark Driscoll earlier. Mark Driscoll, one of the pictures of him that was used for years was him wearing a Mickey Mouse shirt. And of all the things you could wear and of all the characters you could wear, Mickey Mouse is not just a character. Mickey Mouse is a statement of stuff that doesn't matter,
Mm.
so that people would say, you're Mickey Mousing it.
Mm.
They didn't say you're Bugs Bunnying it or,
Mm.
or Mighty Mousing it or Supermaning it. You're Mickey Mousing it. And I always thought of all the images to wear when you're standing in front of God's people, to wear a Mickey Mouse shirt, again. So I'm more old school. But this idea that there was no more division between sacred and secular, there were no sacred spaces. You entered into older buildings. There was a sense, even in the architecture, sometimes of reverence. It
Mm.
drew out reverence. It drew out awe. It made you think that we were here to do something serious. And so some of the accoutrement of Orthodox churches, where there's quiet, there's reverence, the music is old, there are older creedal statements, it's an ancient faith, it looks ancient, the priests dress differently, they look different, there's the robes, the beards, the smells and the bells, as some would say, appeal, I think, primarily to younger men and to younger families looking for something that feels more solid beneath their feet.
Mm.
And so, if I were to give, that's what you've asked me to give. Why do I think it is? I think that there is a longing in the human soul that is not satisfied with the normal, the average, the light, the trite. And so, people talk about certain kinds of modern songs, the Jesus is my boyfriend song, the ditties, whatever terminology you might want to use. But the mind, I think, very often is looking for something more solid to hold on to. And I think particularly, again, younger men tired of feeling feminized by culture, being made to fit into a certain space, which is often a feminine space, and,
Mhm.
and many churches do have a bit more of a feminine type space to them.
Mhm.
I think that this is what is appealing to them.
Mm.
It feels reverent, it feels old, it feels other, that there is in our faith, there are elements of what we call immanence.
Mm.
God is near, God is a father, Abba Father, that's immanence, but God is also transcendent. He is holy, holy,
Mhm.
holy. And I think the idea in many places of worship, not in all, but in many places of worship, the thought that I would ever fall down on my face, that I would ever have an experience like Isaiah had in Isaiah chapter 6, woe is me, I am an unclean man of unclean lips, I live among unclean people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the Lord. To ever have a thought that God is so holy and I am so sinful, that he is so great and I am so small, that I might have what Peter says when he has this encounter with Christ and sees his power, get away from me, Lord, for I'm a sinful man. I think there is something deep in our souls that longs for that and that wants that. And I think even there is something of the appeal of the Reformed faith
Mm,
that is drawing people to it, particularly when other things feel so familiar and intimate in this loss of the transcendent.
yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Kevin? I don't know if that resonates at all with you
Oh, it
or
totally does. As a young man, not that I'm so involved with this, but with technology and algorithms and everything, knowing what young men want, it's pushing certain things at me, which is interesting because a lot of these social medias, YouTube and all of that, they tend to lean more left, but a lot of the algorithm is a lot more targeted for, um, I would actually say some far right things where
Oh,
there's
no,
a
right.
swing
We
and
are seeing a swing,
right.
particularly with younger men to the right.
Yeah, yeah,
There's definitely a swing to the right
right.
that is going on. And when you mentioned this, Kevin, I'm slow to things. I don't see everything. I see some of it. I'll look at YouTube sometimes, but I began to see in my feed or began to see in the shorts these Orthodox men giving statements and but very often rebuking culture, rebuking uh, uh, effeminacy among men and those kinds of things, and in comparison to modern churches, which seem ephemeral, which seem pop up, which seem light on things, they were offering something that at least gives the appearance
Right,
of deeper, creedal,
right.
ancient incense, Gregorian chants, and
Mhm.
you are transported to something very different
Right.
than you are when there's a fog machine and blue lights
Yeah,
and a
absolutely.
flannel shirt guy with jeans on or whatever.
Yeah, yeah, and it's funny because you mentioned the Gregorian chants and everything. A lot of my feed is Catholic and whatnot. So next podcast might be trying to convince the audience of why Catholicism is the way to go. Not there yet, but it's in the works. Just kind of another
Oh, I
question.
mean, Kevin, I don't know if you're aware of this, and one of the top podcasts is, and I don't even know his name, is a younger, nice looking Catholic priest, who has a Bible verse of the day or something like that. It's one
No.
of the top, Apple podcasts. So this has been happening for a little while,
Yeah.
but we're seeing, but what I wasn't seeing that I'm now seeing, is the, Greek and Eastern
Yeah,
Orthodox.
yeah. Do you think the churches so they would have to be blind not to notice young people, especially young men, are leaving their churches, their numbers, their
Right.
less attendance. If you could have, for just bear like humor me with a glass, a crystal ball. If you could look in the future and say, "This is my prediction." What do you think these churches, the response is going to be? Do you think that they'll start to shift and become more orthodox, become more traditional, or do you think they will just die out and it'll be a thing of the past?
Wow, that's a great question, Kevin. If my wife were here, she'd say, "Don't try to predict anything, Jim. You're terrible. You're terrible. You would have been killed long ago
Right.
with your false prophecies." And so, there are so many things that have happened that I don't know that I would have seen happen. And this is one of them. But I do think, again, I think it is tied into some of the crisis of masculinity and some of the appeal to young men of young families. I think it feels safe. And again, it's not just with, there's this spectrum of what's going on. And there are churches that are growing that are appealing to this traditionalism. And so people talk about the trad wife and all of
Mm-hmm.
that sort of a thing where it's appealing to it has almost for in some cases a 1950s or a pre-1950s vibe. I come home from working hard, my wife has made bread, I've got 6 or 7 kids, and we're all homeschooled, and we
Mhm.
all look that way, and it feels safe. And while there's much that's attractive and even much that I would commend with that,
Mhm.
what we have to remember is there was a time when we had societies like this,
Mhm.
and they were ungodly.
Yeah.
And that's the myth. The myth is that if we could get to this place, oh, if only guys didn't look at porn. Well, there was a time guys didn't look at porn, and they were still terrible.
Yeah.
If only men would get married young and have lots of kids. Well, a lot of guys got married young and had lots of kids because that's just what people did.
Yeah.
It didn't mean everything was
Mhm.
godly, and it didn't mean that everything was safe, and it didn't mean that everything was stable.
Right.
And I think that that's what we're looking for. There's the veneer, and then there's that which is the substance. The substance is I want to be able to live with certainty. I want to build something generational. I want to have a legacy. I don't want to feel adrift. I don't want kids to feel like I did. I want them to have purpose and meaning, and know how to shoot something and clean something, and homestead this, or whatever it is. But I think it's all appealing to this sense of I want something. I want something that feels certain. The world feels so uncertain. It feels like it's going to hell in a handbasket
Mhm.
sometimes, and the prognostication of the future, rising transgenderism, the gay rights movement, and all of that stuff that causes people to be afraid of what society is going to look like, and so to withdraw into these more ancient communities feels safe. The problem is you bring your heart, you bring your sin into that,
Mhm.
and you're still not. It doesn't perfect you. It does not mean that your marriage is going to be what it should be. It doesn't mean you're going to treat your wife the way Christ treats the church. Again, it gives, I think, a veneer. It
Mhm.
gives an appearance that is it photographs nicely. It looks good on certain mommy blogs and certain, Instagram pages or YouTube channels. But the reality is, no matter what system you're a part of, you still have to deal with your heart. You still have to
Mhm.
deal with the
Right.
world. You still have to deal with the flesh and the devil, and all of those things. And I think the appeal of the safeguard, that if we can just get there, and I've seen this with the Reformed faith. If I could just be reformed, if I could just get to a confessional church, if I could just get to a place where people believe what I believe, then I'm going to be changed. And again, I think there will be, God willing, yes, there'll be change. Little by little, you by one degree of glory after another, you're going to be made more like Christ. Let
Mhm.
the word of God do its work, as the Spirit of God, but you're still going to have to fight your sin. You're not going to
Mhm.
get to a place you don't have to
Right.
do that
Right.
anymore, where you're out of the warfare, and where I'm safe.
Mhm.
And I think that's what we're looking for. And when it doesn't give it, and like, wow, I'm going to a good church, it's reverent, and I'm being fed by the ministry, but I'm still struggling here. I'm still failing there. And the question very often is, well, what's wrong with the system rather than
Right.
something? There's something wrong with me. And so if I had to look, and I think some of this stuff's going to collapse. I think there are certain movements that are on the rise right now, that if we could go and look 10 years from now, 15 years from now, I think the level of disappointment, I think, and we're already seeing this in some of these cases where inexplicably, marriages are being destroyed, the kids are growing up, very disciplined, and lots of spanking, and all of the rest, and yet they're not embracing the faith, they're leaving the faith. And this is, begins with a cycle perhaps that we started with, of young people leaving the churches. This has been the main press of what's going on in evangelicalism, and even some reformed churches as well. And um, we've not faced it, I don't feel, in our own church to the degree that others have. And I'm thankful to be able to say that
Mhm.
even if some of our younger members are no longer part of our church, they're still going to gospel
Right.
preaching
Right.
churches. They're not going into the world, or they're
Yeah.
you know they're not doing that. And so that's been a part of God's grace with this. And so I think movements that are not ultimately rooted in truth, and I have to say there are so many doctrinal issues that I'm not taking the time now to go into in
Right.
regard to certainly Catholicism, but also some of the Orthodox churches, that because the gospel isn't presented because Christ is not the
Mm,
foundation, tradition is, or this sense of again tradition or otherworldliness is the foundation, that's not ultimately sustainable and doesn't ultimately feed the soul, and it certainly does not have saving grace attached to it.
yeah. Yeah, that's something when you were what you were saying, I was thinking of. I'm curious once, because young people or just people who are kind of tired of the whole, what would it be? I guess the more contemporary church, when they go to these churches and it's not actually their foundation isn't the gospel. It's not actually that they're
Mm.
saved. It's more of a, I want to go somewhere that's like a club almost, where
Mm.
you're with people who sort of believe that you all kind of feel the same
Yeah.
thing. But again, these places are a little bit more shallow. The Catholic Church certainly has all sorts of problems with it, with its the is it called a governmental structure of the Catholic Church and all the division
It's
in
yeah.
there. I'm curious if people are going to say, "Oh, I'm going to look for another branch of Christianity," and then they'll come back to Protestantism and eventually settle again because they understand the tradition, they understand the reverence side of things, but there's
Yeah.
something missing.
Right,
Or
and again, I do think part of the appeal of the Reformed faith, even
yeah,
for somebody like me, and hopefully maybe
mm,
again for you, and I'd maybe talk to you about this later here,
oh,
perhaps another podcast to talk about you've grown up with this your whole life.
mm,
You've not really ever experienced anything other than
mm,
that, other than maybe a visit here or there. But what happens when, as people come into a congregational life, and this is part of what, so even giving this thing the name of Reformation today and
mm,
tomorrow, we're looking at, okay, what does the Reformed faith look like here? And what do we hope, because I'm hopeful of what we're going to see 40, 50 years after I'm gone or 100 years after I'm
mm,
gone. I'm wanting to, in a spiritual sense of what somebody has said. A guy might say, I'm planting trees
mm,
that will shade my grandchildren. That idea, and I won't sit under them, but my grandchildren
yeah,
will. So we're trying to lay things in place
right,
with being a part of a lot of Protestants and a lot of evangelicals have no idea that they're part of a 2,000-year history of the
right,
church.
right,
They have no idea that there were ecumenical creeds and councils that
mm,
that hammered out things about the person and work of Christ and the Trinity. That there was a Reformation and that there was the writing of great new creeds and new confessions that are now hundreds of years
mm,
old, that give to us that tie to the past, which is, I think, again, I think
yeah,
that's
yeah,
good. The problem is, what is that past that you're tying yourself to? And if it's not tied ultimately to the sufficiency of Scripture and to the person and work of Christ and to the simplicity of the gospel and justification by faith and the hope of the Spirit, and if it's in sacraments and
right.
Mary and in saints and in uh,
Smells in the
smells and
bells,
bells,
yeah,
then I think ultimately that can't, because that can't save the soul, it ultimately can't satisfy the soul.
right, yeah, yeah. Well, that was good. I mean, that I'd say you answered the question sufficiently, and I don't want to take too much time. This is something we could potentially revisit here in the future. But yeah, thank you for the time and
You're
thank you
welcome.
for answering this. I hope this was helpful for other young people because we see the both sides. I just personally, I see the appeal of the Catholic Church and the Orthodox. I'm naturally, I don't say I think it's right and it's good, but I'm drawn to the smells and the bells. I understand why people would find that
You really
appealing,
you walk
but
through a door, you are so clearly leaving the world
right,
behind.
right.
And a few years ago, sorry to interrupt here a bit,
Mm,
but I remember one of the church growth gurus saying that what people want, if they're listening to the top 40 on their way into church, that's what they want when they get into
mm,
church. And I'm like, no, they don't. And,
yeah,
and, and it's that idea that we try to make the world look, the church look as much like the world to appeal to people in the
right.
world. And we forget that the primary purpose of the church is the glory of God.
Mm,
Secondly, the edification of
mm,
the saints. And then thirdly, the hope of the reaching of the
mm,
lost. And when we get that backwards and we make the salvation of the lost and the appealing of the lost, and then we lose our sharp edges,
yeah,
excuse me, and we lose our reverence.
Mm.
I would hope that there's a sense in which an unbelieving person ought to find it ought to be so other when they walk in
Right.
here,
Absolutely.
that what they hear and what is being sung and what's being prayed and what's being preached
Yeah.
is so contra mundum, so against the world,
Mm.
that it's almost shocking that
Yeah.
such a place even exists.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. No, I would completely agree that there's appeal to some of the band and the music, right? Because it's sort of stimulating, but then you hit a point where you say, like, there's just not a
I can
point
get this.
here.
I can get this over here.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly. So
So
cool. Well, that's all for today's podcast. Again, we might revisit this in the future, but appreciate you sitting down and tuning in with us, and we'll catch you next time. Bye.